John McMullen's in. He's got NFL news and notes, and there is actually stuff happening today, John. Some people suggesting that the NFL owners kind of took the day off yesterday to kind of make the players a little nervous. Like, what's happening here? How come nobody's making us any offers here?
No, I think the mentality is try to get your own work done as far as extending guys first and then look towards guys outside the organization. So I think it's a little bit of just a timing thing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. On the first day of tampering last year, it felt like there was like a plethora of guys. Like there was news all over the place.
Yeah, it was a little bit slow, especially early yesterday. So who knows? Maybe everyone was looking for Scott McClugan. I don't know, but it certainly has picked up today.
It has. Let's go over some of the stuff that has happened today. Let's start with, I guess, recently here, Brian Hoyer is now in San Francisco, and let's read the tea leaves on that. Cousins, San Francisco. Hoyer kind of gets a smaller deal, it looks like, a much smaller deal. He doesn't even get the Glennon type of deal. What do you think of Hoyer? What does that mean for 49ers and possibly Cousins?
Well, I always thought it was unlikely that Kirk Cousins would be traded to San Francisco this season. And it's just a matter, to me, Brian Hoyer's the ultimate bridge quarterback. He's the bridge to Kirk Cousins in 2018. If the Redskins can't work out a long-term deal, I don't think there's any question about it. He's guaranteed to be a free agent in 2018 if he wants to go that route, and Kyle Shanahan will be sitting there waiting for him if that comes to pass. But if you're the 49ers and you're sitting there with the number 2 overall pick, as much as he likes Kirk Cousins, you can't move that pick for Kirk Cousins, and on top of it, pay him $20 million per year. That's just not good value. So I always thought it was very, very unlikely that trade would come to pass, and I think the 49ers are going the bridge route and holding off. In a larger sense, Mike, Tyrod Taylor going back to Buffalo as well plays into this. For the first time, and I just tweeted out, I'm starting to think NFL teams really don't like this quarterback class because everybody seems to be going for the veteran option.
You're talking about the draft class.
Correct.
Not the free agent class, just to clear that up.
No, the free agent class which is not good either. But the point is, when you're sitting there and looking at whoever, Trubisky, Kaiser, Watson, whatever order you want to put them in, and you're starting to think Mike Glennon's better, Tyrod Taylor's better, that tells you the guys in this league don't think highly of this class coming in, the draft class.
Yeah, I think we knew it was a weaker class. We talked about Glennon yesterday. But real quick on Hoyer, too. He's going to have a receiver to throw to, but they're paying that receiver $16 million a year, it sounds like. Pierre Garcon's going to go back with Kyle Shanahan. He's leaving Washington to go to San Francisco. $16 million sounds preposterous to me.
Well, that's only the first year guaranteed money, so I haven't knocked down the full, but he's not getting 16 per year, which I understand would be way preposterous, and that's just going to be the first year money for Pierre Garcon, and he's a very good receiver, and Kyle Shanahan's obviously very, very comfortable with him. They're also going to bring in Marquise Goodwin from Buffalo, so. And people have already speculated he's obviously a speed threat, and people have already made the connection of Kyle Shanahan sort of turning him into the next Taylor Gabriel. We'll see if that works out, but I'm not sure until I like Brian Hoyer as a bridge guy, and I think he's a reliable guy. But let's face it, he's not Matt Ryan, so I wouldn't expect similar Atlanta-like numbers in San Francisco.
Yeah, Garcon, though, even $16 million for just the first year. I mean, is he? Does that make any sense to you to say we're going to give you $16 million just to come here?
It makes sense from the standpoint that Shanahan's comfortable with him.
All right, I could go that route.
Yeah, I would have gone in a different. I thought they were going to go in the Jeffrey direction, which would have been more money, certainly. But the fact that he is, and I've always said, dating back, I think people underrate Pierre Garcon. He reminds me a lot of a younger Anquan Bolden,
Yes.
and he's not going to wow you with his speed, but he runs great routes. He's extremely strong. He fights for the football, and he's just very, very productive. So I'm not surprised because they're trying to change the culture of that organization, and that's the type of player they want.
More NFL news and notes. John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter. Jason LaConfora reporting the Dolphins making a push to keep Kenny Stills. He's a guy that obviously in this wide receiver market, there's a handful of names. He's one of them. Do you think that ultimately, though, he ends up back in Miami?
Well, I think, and this is a positive for the Eagles, I think his number is not going to be as large as some speculated. And I think the Dolphins are offering him about $8 million a year, and that indicates he's not nearly going to be as expensive as we first thought. So I think it's possibly a positive for Miami, but it's a positive for other teams that might want to bring Kenny Stills in because they're not going to have to pay as much as they first thought. So we'll see how it shakes out. I think the more interesting thing in Miami is they fielded phone calls about Jarvis Landry, who is a tremendous receiver. And if someone could pry him away from Miami, well, that would be something.
That would be via trade, by the way, just to let he's not a free agent, right?
Yeah. No, that would be a trade.
All right, John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. We'll get into some Eagles news here in just a minute. A couple guys released that you probably would recognize. Elvis Dumervil was released today by the Ravens. You also see Romo probably going to be released tomorrow. Is that the scuttlebutt now that he will be a free agent tomorrow?
Yes, and probably with the post-June 1st designation so the Cowboys can split it over 2 seasons, and that was always the natural progression. It was just going to be incredibly difficult to trade him because of his cap number, and it's just not feasible. So this was always going to be the end game, and now I think it comes down to I think Tony would prefer Houston, but they have to pay Brock Osweiler, and they can't trade him, and they can't release him because it would be a cap hit of astronomical proportions. So they can't move on from him till 2018. So I think it comes down to how malleable Tony Romo wants to be. But ultimately, I think he's either the starting quarterback in Denver or the starting quarterback in Houston.
They're the top two, you would think, after 14 years. It looks like Romo is going to be the Romo era will finally done. Will be a free agent. That will be tomorrow, according to Adam Schefter. You mentioned Tyrod Taylor. He's agreed to restructure the contract to stay with the Bills. I guess the Bills just looked around and said, look, we don't have a better option right now. We got to bring him back.
Yeah, I think it was smart. We've talked about that for weeks. I think part of it was also the Bills started to realize that they were not going to get something done, that teams were lining up to sign Tyrod Taylor, whether it was Cleveland or what could be worse for the Bills. I think the Jets would have jumped on it, and then you got to deal with them in the division. So there were a lot of teams that were going to look at him and say, hey, that guy's an upgrade. We'll take him. So I think it was natural for them to keep him. And it's interesting, if you go back to when Rex Ryan was there, the whole sort of schism between him and the front office was that he wanted Tyrod Taylor and the front office didn't, and all of a sudden they hire a new coach and he wants him too. So I think you could do a lot worse than Tyrod Taylor. So I think the Buffalo Bills made a prudent decision.
By the way, just to throw this number out there for the Garcon conversation, at $16 million next year, he will be the second highest paid wideout in the league. Antonio Brown is number 1. A.J. Green is number 3, and Pierre Garcon will fit nicely right there in the middle in San Francisco. I just scratched my head at that because he's an older guy. It's not like he's a long-term when they're like a team that hopefully is building towards a Super Bowl, like I just don't see him being a part of that.
Well, I think a lot of that, and I was talking with Josh off air before I jumped on, contracts are about timing, and that's it. I mean, you're a free agent now. The cap has gone up 7%. There's over $1.3 billion NFL teams have to spend. If some of the great receivers were on the open market that you mentioned, they'd be getting a heck of a lot more money. But it's about timing. It's about when you're up. And it's Pierre Garcon's turn. Wherever Alshon Jeffrey, for instance, is going to sign, he's going to get more than that. So he'll go down the list. And as he gets to next year, who's ever a free agent is a big-time receiver is going to get more money than that. That becomes sort of the demarcation line that you say, well, Pierre Garcon's getting that. I want this. And that's just how negotiating goes in this league.
Darrelle Revis, your thoughts on him. If you're a team that needs a corner, you taking a shot on Revis, or is he done?
No, I think he's done as a corner. I think he could have some life as a safety if he was open to that, sort of doing what a Charles Woodson or Rod Woodson did at the end of their Hall of Fame careers, because I think he's smart enough to do it. I think he's physical enough to do it. The problem with Darrelle Revis is he's used to getting paid a ton of money, and I think Adrian Peterson's in the same category, and they're not going to find that money. So, and they're very prideful players, and in the case of Revis especially, if he doesn't get at least $8 million or so, I don't know if he even wants to play. And I don't see a situation where somebody's going to offer him $8 million.
Right, because of the way his contract is situated in the Jets, they have to pay him, but if he doesn't make at least $8 million, he's essentially going to be playing for free.
Yeah, exactly. And when you talk about a guy who's bet on himself time and time again, remember he played on franchise tag, and then finally got the big money deal. He's got a ton of money in the bank. He's used to making a ton of money every year, and it's just not going to be there for him.
All right, John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. A lot of other news out here. Let's go to some of the Eagles stuff that's out there. A.J. Bouye, according to Ed Werder, the Texans are concerned about losing him to the Eagles. You had some reports locally yesterday saying they have some interest in him. Some reports in Houston saying the Eagles are not really a threat here. Put your stamp on it.
Well, I look at Aaron Wilson, who's the Houston Chronicle reporter, says, and he's really plugged into the Texans, so he was the one who reported that the Eagles aren't in play. So I tend to lean towards that only because I think if you look at Houston's trying to bring him back, and there are two teams in the division, the AFC South, Tennessee and Jacksonville, who are also working hard to get something done with A.J. Bouye. So when you look at the Eagles' cap situation, it's down to $6+ million now after the Trey Burton tender. They obviously have to make moves. They're trying to trade Connor Barwin, trying to trade Michael Kendricks. So they'll have more money under the cap. But if you go and get an A.J. Bouye, who I've said on this show is the number one free agent, and obviously at a need position, so it would be a home run for the Eagles. But it's going to be very difficult to do much else unless it's through trade and things of that nature. Now, Howie's proven to be very, very inventive, and we'll see how it shakes out. But the Eagles are behind the eight ball because there's so much interest in A.J. Bouye.
Okay. You say number one, period. Is he a situation, though, like Asamoah? Like, you bring him in here and it's the wrong system and he just doesn't fit? Or is he a guy that could come and play in Jim Schwartz's defense? Because I think that is a big factor. Asamoah, everybody, I think, would have – any team that signed Asamoah would have been happy. Any team that signed Byron Maxwell, not at that money, probably would have been happy. But do they fit? And I don't think because you got burned once or twice that means you can't put your foot back in the water. You eventually have to, dive in there and say, look, we can't let our past decisions frustrate us from making a decision that is a good one moving forward. So is Bouye a good decision, meaning he could fit in this defense?
Yeah, he would. He would fit into a Jim Sports defense because he's a very good press corner, very good bump and run corner. And the second part, and I agree with what you said, I know a lot of fans are worried about it, and they'll automatically go back to Roseman, Maxwell. But remember, Joe Douglas is running the personnel department. He didn't strike out on these guys. So it doesn't have an effect on his mind. He's not thinking about that. He's thinking about how this guy's a fit. And anybody who saw him play last season can see his upside. The second comparison when you talk about Asamoah was a veteran player on the downside. This is the exact opposite. This is a young kid who's got 19 starts, is tremendous athletically, and he's only going up. So, and that's the reason he's at the top of the free agency
Keep in mind,
board.
for the people out there, he is an undrafted kid, too. So this isn't a guy who came in with big credentials.
No. And that worries some people as well. But I think that should sort of – we've seen it time and time again. There are undrafted players in the Hall of Fame. I covered one of them for a lot of years, and that's John Randall. And he was undrafted when they had 12 rounds in the draft, and he's in the Hall of Fame. So these guys miss people occasionally, and you have to look at it on the field. And Houston's a perfect example because they took Kevin Johnson in the first round of the draft. He's a corner. And nobody in Houston is going to tell you that Kevin Johnson's better than A.J. Bouye because they've seen the two play, and they know who the better player is.
Any interest in Gilmore or Kirkpatrick if you're the Eagles, or are you, because, there's that whole theory of whatever a team in your division does something, you got to build, back in the day, you drafted Bobby Taylor to go up against Michael Irvin. You don't only have Dez Bryant and Odell Beckham. If you're playing the Giants, you got Odell Beckham and Brandon Marshall to deal with now.
Yeah, you do, but I wrote about that today on FanRag. I wouldn't be that concerned if I'm Eagles fans, and it doesn't have to do with Brandon Marshall because I think Brandon Marshall's, even though he's going to be 33 later this month, he's still a really good player. Bottom line is the quarterback is declining rapidly in with the Giants, and somebody's got to get him the football. And if you go back to last season, when people were saying the Giants were going to have the best wide receiver group in the NFL, the mentality was, okay, we all know how good OBJ is. There's no question about that. But then people said Victor Cruz because he had a big name. And I would tell people he's shot physically. He's not the same guy. So people get caught up in big names. Now, the big name here the issue isn't Marshall. He can still play. The big name is Eli Manning, who is rated, I think, Pro Football Focus rated him the 27th best quarterback in the NFL last season. He's not good, if anyone has been paying attention. So don't get me wrong, Mike. The Eagles have to improve at the cornerback position, but not because Brandon Marshall's in New York, simply because the Giants haven't realized they need to improve at the quarterback position.
All right, let's look at some other quick news and notes. Torrey Smith, Jason La Canfora says he'd be pretty surprised if he does not end up back in Baltimore or with Philadelphia. We heard his name around Philly last year. Now that he's out there, does he move to the top of the Eagles' wish list?
I hope not. I mean, to me, that signals a disaster for the Eagles. And look, he had a bad season in San Francisco, and that's not necessarily all on him because that was we talked about bad quarterback situations. That might have been the worst with Blaine Gabbert and Colin Kaepernick throwing him the football. But the bottom line is, even at the apex of his career, he was the one-trick pony. He's got speed, but that's all he can do. And he was never the one-trick pony like Deshaun Jackson was, who was really, really successful. He'd make a big play every now and again, but the consistency is just not there. And I don't think that's a big enough upgrade for the Philadelphia Eagles at a position they need a significant upgrade.
All right. And that, he was number 2 in the league, yards per catch 2 years ago. So, I mean, yes, maybe inconsistent.
He can run.
Yeah. And they need a guy who could do
No
that.
question about that.
Not if he's the only guy you add.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think if you bring him in, you're sort of in that same situation. This team needs a legitimate number 1 receiver and probably a legitimate number 2 receiver. They need both. And then if Torrey Smith is your number 3, well then, yeah, I think you're fine.
Right.
But that's not what the situation would be. And I think that's a problem if you're bringing him in and expecting him. It's certainly a problem if you're expecting him to be your number 1. And it's probably even an issue if you want him to be your number 2.
Any shot? I mean, is the reason why a guy like Barwin, Kendricks, those guys, are they trying to move them? Is that why maybe one or both of those guys haven't been released yet?
Yeah, they're trying to trade him, and it's increasingly difficult because other teams are aware. Look, the NFLPA releases the figures every morning now, so everybody in the league knows the Eagles have less than $7 million in cap space. So everybody you're dealing with understands you have to release these guys if you don't move them. And that makes it much more difficult to trade them. The Eagles are certainly trying. I'm sure they're trying to talk New Orleans into taking those contracts and maybe a second-round pick and try to get Brandon Cooks that way. But that's a lot of salary to take on for the Saints. So that's one that if Howie's able to pull off, we'll be lauding him again.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, at JF McMullen, as NFL free agency officially begins right after the strike of midnight tonight. And we'll probably have plenty to discuss on tomorrow's show, John. And is there anything else out there today that has occurred that you would like to comment on before we move on?
Well, I think, one thing is as far as high-profile players, I also wrote about Adrian Peterson today. His camp is trying to sort of drum up interest, which I think tells you all you need to know. We mentioned on the show that he wasn't going to find the numbers he thought in free agency, so they're saying they want to play in Seattle, they want to play in Oakland, but those teams are looking at it for $2 or $3 million a year. And that kind of tells you how the mighty can fall very, very quickly.
All right, we'll keep an eye on NFL free agency tomorrow. It is officially underway, and we'll see if your favorite team, by the way, Barry Church in Jacksonville, so his time in Dallas is done. Other moves, some lower profile moves happening throughout the day here that we'll be keeping an eye on as well. Josh passed me a pretty funny note here when you look in Miami, who signed a long-term deal with Andre Branch for $9 million. They let
and they didn't want Olivier Vernon. They didn't want to pay him $8 million.
Right, last year they ended up having to pony up.
Yeah.
Right, they have to end up ponying up an extra $1 million to keep probably a lesser player this year. All right, John, back tomorrow.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, FanRag Sports NFL 97.3 ESPN.com at JF McMullen.